This presentation is for volunteers here at the Wildlife Center of the North Coast to talk a little bit more about fish for animals here that eat fish and how we store and prepare the fish in order to provide our animal patients with optimal nutrition. If you are a volunteer here, you might feel like we already talk about fish a lot, talking about purchasing fish and storing fish and washing fish and cutting fish. And you might feel like you really talk about fish already as much as you ever wanted to or thought that you might. So I'm going to try to be fairly brief today, and I am going to just give you an overview of some of the information that our permitting agencies would like you to know about fish and feeding fish to fish-eating animals. The animals here in care at the Wildlife Center, for the most part, are not going to be doing foraging or looking for food on their own. And that means that they are dependent on us here to make sure that their nutritional needs are being met and that they are getting a high-quality diet that will help them to overcome whatever challenges brought them here to the Wildlife Center in the first place. Being a wild animal, as we know, isn't particularly easy, and there are plenty of things that can go wrong at any point in the process of an animal's life cycle. And when they're here at the center, there's plenty of things that we can help with, and there's also plenty of things that we can't. One thing that we can control for animals here in our care is their nutrition, at least to the extent that we can get them to eat what we are feeding them. And if we give them the best possible nutrition, we're giving them an advantage that will benefit them when we eventually return them to the wild. So the USDA actually has standards for fish that are being fed to wild animals in care. These standards are obviously different than the standards they use when it comes to fish for feeding to people in restaurants or for selling in grocery stores. So we don't have to meet that high of a standard, but there are standards that we're expected to meet. And the basics of those standards mean that fish fed to wildlife should be of high quality and it should have good nutritional content. We can feed whole fish. We don't need to remove bones, organs, scales, but we should be feeding fish that is in generally good condition so that its nutritional content is preserved and animals eating it can get from the fish the nutrients that they need. Here on this slide, I've included this graphic that shows the general progression of fish as it thaws out and is at progressively warmer temperatures and what happens in terms of preservation of the fish. I included this just as a way to make it easier to kind of conceptualize the effect that thawing and then sitting at a warmer temperature has on fish. All of which to say is that, whenever possible, we want to be thawing fish in the refrigerator. And then once the fish is thawed, trying to use it within a fairly short window of time, ideally within 48 hours. We do, sometimes end up in situations in the kitchen, during pelican season, for example, where it becomes necessary to thaw fish in cold water in order to get it done more quickly than the refrigerator thawing can do. But if we do that, we should be aiming to use that fish within 24 hours because beyond that point, the fish becomes degraded and has less nutritional value. If fish is going to be thawed and then refrozen, so sometimes we end up with larger quantities of fish, and we know that if we thaw them out, we can't use them all at one time and need to repackage and refreeze. If we do this, we shouldn't let it thaw all the way. So, looking at this graphic, stage 3 there in the middle in yellow, where the fish is, not covered in crystallized ice, but it keeps its shape. It's still cold and it's at a temperature right around freezing. That would be as far as we want to thaw fish if we plan to refreeze it. So that's especially important to remember, during those times when we're repackaging large amounts of fish into smaller quantities to stick in the freezer. If fish is partially thawed and then frozen for a second time, you can't refreeze it again. So, if you thaw it out, once it's thawed out, you should be planning to use it. You don't want to refreeze that fish. So why does it make a difference to an extent that we would want to pay this much attention to, fish that are being fed to wild animals that when they are in the wild are obviously not going to be picky eaters? And a big part of that is because we are processing the fish in a way that it doesn't get processed in the wild, right? Like they're not going to be, packaging and freezing fish in a wild environment. Animals are going to be getting the fish from natural sources like the water. So because of the fact that we're doing some level of processing, there is the potential for nutrient loss for fish that isn't handled well. There's the potential for it becoming rancid. Here in the clinic, there's obviously potential for exposure to bacteria or other contaminants. And we want to minimize that potential to the extent that we can. And also, if fish gets really gross, animals don't want to eat it, right? So if we've got fish that's been frozen and refrozen and allowed to get really degraded and we try to feed it to an animal, there's the nutrient loss component, but there's also just the fact that an animal may really lack interest in eating it. And getting animals to eat well while they're here is part of their recovery. So what should fish look like? Here is a graphic that gives kind of an overview of what fish looks like when it is in acceptable form for feeding to wildlife patients. So it doesn't have to be perfect, right? This is fish that's been frozen and thawed and potentially squished a little along the way, that kind of thing. But what we don't want to see is fish that is bloated or has, viscera and intestines and things hanging out. It's okay for it to be bent, but you don't want it to have like cloudy eyes or red eyes or, broken skin everywhere. So you're basically just looking for a fish that still looks like a fish with all of its parts, inside of it where they belong, and that doesn't look diseased or degraded. Fish that you wouldn't want to feed to a wild animal would be, if it smells bad, worse than usual. If you see that its gills have like mucus or, slime, if it looks really dried out, dehydrated, if the skin is really damaged and you have, intestines and viscera falling out. So you're basically not wanting to feed animals fish that looks like it's, gross and falling apart and maybe potentially had some kind of issue while it was alive. Just some other general considerations for the handling and feeding of fish. You're going to want to wash your hands before and after handling fish, and ideally wear gloves whenever you're handling fish that will be given to an animal's food. This is a good idea to protect you and also to protect the animal. Fish should be kept under refrigeration as much as possible prior to feeding. So, once it's thawed out, we want to keep it cold. So thinking in terms of temperatures that are above 40 degrees as where bacterial growth can happen. So, the refrigerator is under that, and ideally any place that we're keeping the fish is also going to be under that. Surfaces and utensils used for fish preparation before feeding should be clean and sanitized so that we're not taking something that is on those utensils or surfaces and potentially getting it on the fish before we feed it to the animal. So I think this is actually a pretty handy graphic here in terms of how we are handling fish in the kitchen and, what kind of our time frames look like. So if fish has been, sitting at a temperature above freezing for under 2 hours, we could put it back in the fridge and use it again later. If it has been sitting out for longer than 2 hours, between 2 and 4 hours, can still be fed to animals. We can still use it, but probably should not be putting it back into the refrigerator. And if it's been sitting out for over 4 hours, likely it should be thrown away. Now, all that being said, there's some nuance there. So if you think that fish has been left out for too long and may not be usable, don't throw it away without asking staff at the center. So before throwing away fish, just always check with someone to make sure that it truly is unusable and isn't something that we're going to want to try to make use of. This graphic kind of summarizes all of our safe fish handling information. So I like this because it kind of takes everything I've talked about here and sort of puts it all in one place. So this is a good one to bookmark in some way, or take a good look at so you can remember some of these details. So basically, fish that's in these stages 1 through 3 where it's been kept cold, it keeps its shape. That's great to feed to animals, even up to through stage 4. But let's not be feeding fish to animals if it's really degraded, if it has a bad smell, if it's been, sitting out a long time, those kinds of things. Okay, so now that we have gone through all of this information about best practices for handling and processing fish before feeding them to animals here at the center, I have a little quiz for you. And you can access the quiz by clicking on this link here on the slide. And once you have taken the quiz and passed it, I have a little prize for you, which is a shiny new button that says that you are a Wildlife Center of the North Coast Fish Handling Pro. And you can pick up your button by just letting a staff member know that you have viewed this module and taken the quiz to go along with it. And that wraps up my overview on best practices for fish handling when feeding fish to animals that enjoy eating them. I made a note here of the resource that I used to summarize information for this presentation. And that way, if any of you find that you would like to learn about this more in depth or get some more information, you can look that up online. Thanks for taking time to listen.